Sperm Wars by Robin Baker. Preface. Sex and reproduction occupy a major part of people's time, not so much the doing, more the thinking and talking. Despite all this attention, most people find their own sexual activities, responses, and emotions the most baffling of all aspects of their lives. Consider the following. Why, in the midst of a perfectly happy and satisfying relationship, do we sometimes get an incredibly strong urge to be unfaithful? Why do men inseminate enough sperm at each intercourse to fertilize the entire population in the United States twice over? And why then do half of them dribble back down the woman's leg? Why should we feel like sex so often when most of the time we don't want children? Why, when we least want children, do our bodies apparently let us down and produce them? Why, when we do want children, do our bodies apparently let us down and not produce them? Why is it so difficult to know the best time to have sex in order to conceive or not to conceive? Why is the penis the shape it is, and why do we thrust during intercourse? Why do we get such strong urges to masturbate, and why do some of us have orgasms while asleep at night? Why is the female orgasm so unpredictable and so difficult to induce? Why are some people more interested in sex with members of their own sex? These are just some of the questions to which most people, if they are honest, have no sensible or at least consistent answer. Nonetheless, riding on the waves of our evolution in sexual understanding, which began in the 1970s, but which did not really gain momentum until the 1990s, there are questions which this book sets out to answer. So far, its revolution in the interpretation of sexual behavior has been the sole prerogative of academics, evolutionary biologists to be precise. In this book, my aim is to bring the new interpretation for the first time within the reach of a much wider audience. But the potential exists to revolutionize the way we all think about sex. My ambition is to help the revolution on its way. The main message from this revolution is that our sexual behavior has been programmed and shaped by evolutionary forces which acted on our ancestors and which still act on us even today. The main thrust of these forces was directed at our bodies, not our consciousnesses. Our bodies simply use our brains to manipulate us into behaving in a way dictated by our programming. The central force that directed this programming was the risk of sperm warfare. Whenever a woman's body contains sperm from two or more different men at the same time, the sperm from those men compete for the prize of fertilizing her eggs. The way in which these sperm compete is akin to warfare. Very few, less than 1% of the sperm in a human ejaculate are the elite fertile egg getters. The remainder are infertile kamikaze sperm, whose function has nothing to do with fertilization as such, but everything to do with preventing sperm from another man fertilizing the egg. Sperm warfare is a story in itself, but it also has wide-ranging consequences at all levels of human sexual behavior, in part consciously, but much more importantly subconsciously. All of our sexual attitudes, emotions, responses, and behavior revolve around sperm warfare, and all human sexual behavior can be reinterpreted from this new perspective. Thus, most male behavior is an attempt either to prevent a woman from exposing his sperm to warfare, or if he fails in this, to give his sperm the best chance of winning the warfare. Most female behavior is an attempt either to outmaneuver her partner and other males, or to influence which male's sperm has the best chance of succeeding in any war that she promotes. For each one of us, there was a critical moment sometime in the past when one of our father's sperm entered one of our mother's eggs and we were conceived. That event unleashed a complex set of instructions for development. Those instructions were inherited half from our father and half from our mother, and eventually produced the person we are today. If our father and mother hadn't had sex when they did, with whom they did, having prepared for it as they did, we would have never existed. Behind every conception lies a story, but the details of these stories are rarely known. How many of us know, for example, whether our mother climaxed at our conception? If so, whether she did so before, after, or at the same time as our father? Did either our father or mother masturbate in the days or hours preceding our conception? Was either of them bisexual, or was either of them being unfaithful to their partner at the time? When we were conceived, did our mother contain sperm from only one man, or did she contain sperm from two or even more? Is the man we call our father actually the man who produces sperm which fertilize the eggs which we were developed? These things will have made a difference to our personal origins, and understanding the precise way in which they did is one of the most interesting outcomes of the new revolution. Most people, of course, are conceived during an act of routine sex between a man and a woman who are living together in some form of long-term relationship. This is true now and probably has been true for at least the last 3 or 4 million years. Such conceptions might seem humdrum, but even routine sex has its surprises, as I hope this book will illustrate. And for those 1 in 5 or so people who are not the product of routine sex, there is an even more interesting story behind their conception. Many such stories are told in this book. In 1995, Dr. Mark Bellis and I published a book called Human Sperm Competition, Copulation, Masturbation, and Infidelity. In that book, published by Chapman and Howell, we presented the results of recent biological research, much of it's our own, about the repercussions for human sexuality of the risk of sperm warfare. We argue that almost every aspect of human sexuality, including much of the familiar and humdrum, owed its characteristics to the occurrence or at least the risk of sperm warfare. If you wish to read a scientific justification for the ideas and claims made in this book, then read Human Sperm Competition. Of necessity, that book is full of jargon, data, graphs, and tables, which inevitably distance it from most people's experience. Nevertheless, it contains an interpretation and explanation for all the sexual behavior that is very much within most people's experience. Behavior that often seems irrational and inexplicable. The research shows, though, that sexual behavior, in all of its mundane, embarrassing, pleasurable, risky, criminal, amoral, and exotic forms, does obey fundamental rules. In order to illustrate these rules and to bring these behaviors to light, I have written this book as a series of fictional scenes. Every scene involves some form of sexual conflict between males and females, or most often between males and females. Many scenes also involve one or other facet of sperm warfare, which I argue throughout the book is the underlying element in all sexual behavior. Each piece of fiction is followed by an interpretation of the behavior just witnessed from the viewpoint of an evolutionary biologist. The fictional scenes show people acting out these sexual strategies that have been the main target for investigation and interpretation in recent years. While I have drawn evidence about how the people behave from a wide range of scientific surveys and experimental studies in which in total many thousands of people around the world have taken part, the stories themselves naturally enough are contrived. Their aim is, after all, to show people experiencing particular costs and benefits of their sexual behavior, so as to neatly illustrate the subsequent evidence and interpretation. My challenge was to create characters and scenarios that offered a reasonably entertaining and plausible piece of fiction while at the same time reflecting the evidence. In writing these stories, I've drawn on less global information than do the studies and experiments themselves, and although some stories originate in news reports and the media, most derive from events in my own life and the lives of close friends and family. All the scenes have been inspired by actual events. Even so, my friends should not waste their time trying to guess identities, nor should the reader waste his or her time trying to identify particular news stories. Every character is an amalgam, and every story a mosaic of several different events. Moreover, every character described could be of any race and almost any nationality, and every scene could be set in almost any country. Not every event and every scene is interpreted on the spot, but every element of behavior mentioned is interpreted in its own right somewhere in the book. For example, I've dedicated 2 scenes to masturbation, one to male and one to female. After each of these scenes, I discuss the function. Elsewhere, scenes of sexual behavior often involve characters have masturbated without my interpreting their behavior then and there. But once a function has been gleaned from their dedicated scenes, the involvement in other scenes should be clear. In writing my interpretation, I have tried not to lapse into the academic style that is my natural bent. I've tried to avoid too much mention of numbers and where a particular explanation is complex. I've tried to give a brief and entertaining version even if it means sacrificing academic precision. I have also avoided using the words probably or possibly on many occasions when, strictly speaking, they were needed. Any reader with a scientific background who becomes frustrated by the lack of academic rigor in my text should seek information explanation they require in the treatise I wrote with Mark Bellis. Not all of my fellow academics will agree with my interpretations or even with the details of what is going on between men and women, between sperm and the female tract, between sperm and the egg, or between sperm themselves. There are people eminent in their fields who will consider this whole book to be a fiction, interpretations as well as scenes. So be it. The point is that I have opted to tell a story based on genuine academic interpretation of recent research. Apart from this self-imposed starting point, my primary consideration thereafter is that the story should be consistent and interesting. I have not even begun to present all sides of other people's views. To have done so would have made the book confusing, overlong, even dull. Other people's interpretations are discussed and appraised at great length in Human Sperm Competition. in which Mark Bellis and I say precisely why we think the story I present here is the best currently available. Having argued the case there, I feel free here to tell the story as simply and as entertainingly as I can manage. One of the problems I encountered in writing this book is that much of the behavior I am attempting to interpret requires a totally explicit picture of what happens. Many of the scenes and details I describe could, in another context, be considered pornographic. I've tried not to be gratuitously explicit and hope that for every scene or detail a reader might find embarrassing or titillating, the explanation that follows will provide adequate justification. I have a further problem. A large part of the behavior I describe and interpret is to many people at best amoral and at worst criminal. In my view, it is most important that I do not strike any moral stances. As an evolutionary biologist, my aim is to interpret human behavior without prejudice or criticism. The danger is that many people will interpret my lack of criticism of certain forms of behavior as meaning that I condone or encourage that behavior. However, as I explained in scene 33 in relation to rape, the first step in dealing with antisocial behavior is to understand it, and that, and nothing else, is the aim of all my interpretations. This book could never have been written had it not been for the scientific collaboration with Mark Bellis. I owe him a great debt. For 7 years, from 1987 until 1994, we discussed, investigated, and argued about every aspect of human sexuality. We did not agree on everything, but to a surprising extent, one or other of us eventually became persuaded by the other's arguments. Sufficiently persuaded, that it is, to collaborate in writing the academic book that is the scientific foundation for this one. Although Mark will not agree with all the ideas I present here, some of which have emerged since he left Manchester University to start his important work on the epidemiology of AIDS and other sexually transmitted diseases, most of the ideas presented here are as much his as mine. He should not be held responsible, however, for the way any of these ideas are presented. Naturally, he is totally free of blame for my fictional representations. I also am grateful to Fourth Estate, particularly Michael Mason and Christopher Potter, for showing what I consider to be great courage in publishing this book, not because of the subject matter, but for their confidence that I could actually deliver a saleable product. Before they offered their support, I had no grounds for thinking I could write a book such as this, previously having written only academic text. I hope the end result has justified their initial confidence. By far my biggest thanks must go to my partner, Elizabeth Oram, who has encouraged and helped me at every step of the way. She did so despite considerable physical discomfort, the conception, gestation, and delivery of this book coinciding with the conception, gestation, and delivery of our second child. The book was conceived over breakfast one Saturday in October 1994, 3 months to the day after the conception of our child. Without her immediate encouragement, I would never have dared to begin this project. As Liz in the book grew, she applied her considerable writing and editorial skills to prevent me from making many of the mistakes that would have exposed me as a novice I am in the popular genre. First, she saved me from my urge to be even more graphic in my description of sexual scenes that I have. If the final results are interesting and explicit but still tasteful, they owe much to her restraint and advice. Secondly, she saved me as much as she possibly could from being outlandishly pompous and diegetic in writing the interpretations. If the book still contains elements of pornography or pomposity, the fault lies not with her advice, but with my stubbornness or reluctance to kill words that I conceived with such difficulty. Finally, as the race to deliver the manuscript before Liz delivered our baby gathered momentum, she did everything she could to make sure I didn't sacrifice quality for speed. In order to free time for me to finish the manuscript, she allowed me to shirk many of my parental and household responsibilities. Not once was I made to feel guilty. Moreover, she read and reread successive drafts of each scene and interpretation whenever I asked, even late at night. Throughout all the pressure, when I could so easily have decided that this or that sloppy paragraph would do, she never once allowed her editorial standards to drop. Her final effort was superhuman. When I failed to complete the manuscript by the expected delivery date of our baby, she hung on and refused to give birth for a further 10 days. Thanks to the time she freed for me, I managed to deliver the manuscript to the Fourth Estate just before our first daughter, Amelia, was born on April 25th, 1995. Chapter 1. The Generation Game. Scene 1. Great Uncle Who? The faces in the creased brown photograph stared impassively at the woman, their gazes spanning the 100 years between them. She loved this photograph and often asked to see it when she visited her grandmother. The faces belonged to 3 young children, all long dead, frozen in time by some ancient camera at a moment early in their lives. They were standing in a line, tallest and oldest on the left, shortest and youngest on the right. The 2 boys at either end were aged about 10 and 2, the pretty girl in the middle about 5. Whenever the young woman looked at these faces, she sensed a continuity with the past that she never experienced at any other time. The photograph showed her great-grandmother with her two brothers, but with very little stretching of the imagination. It could be her looking out from the photograph, not her great-grandmother. The resemblance between them as children was uncanny. Her grandmother called it the family face, so many of their clan having the same bone structure and eyes. The woman looked at her photograph a little longer, then asked her grandmother to tell her the story of their family just one more time. Before speaking, the old woman fumbled to the front of the album and took out a large sheet of paper. The family tree was her pride and joy, and she loved showing it and the photographs of to her many grandchildren. The young woman concentrated hard as her grandmother spoke, determined this time to remember what was said. She knew that one of the boys in the photograph had not lived long enough to have children. Her great-grandmother, however, had not only survived, but had also escaped the poverty of her family background. She had been a pretty child who had grown into a beautiful young woman chased by all the young men in the village. One day, while working as a servant in a large household, she had fallen pregnant to the owner's son. The baby was her grandmother, the teller of the story. Instead of being disowned and sent away, her great-grandmother was welcomed into the family. Everything happened so quickly that despite gossip, nobody ever knew for sure that the baby had been conceived illegitimately. The young couple then lived together in relative comfort for the rest of their lives and produced four more children. All were boys, and unusual for their generation, all had survived. Their grandmother then pointed to the oldest boy in the photograph, her uncle. He had not been as lucky as his sister. Failing to escape the poverty into which he had been born, he had worked hard all his life. Like his sister, he had also had five children. Three had died as babies, and one of the survivors, a boy, had been killed in the war when only 18 years old. The other survivor, a girl, was infertile and died alone in her 50s, a few years after her partner. The youngest boy, the one with the bright eye and a smile, had died of measles about 2 years after the photograph was taken. The young woman pored over the family tree with her grandmother. The tree had the shape of a pyramid, three names at the top, the three young children in the photograph, and about 50 at the bottom, the woman's own generation. Then suddenly she noticed something that had never occurred to her before. Every single one of the 50 people in her generation traced back to her great-grandmother, the pretty girl in the picture. Not one, of course, traced back to either of those two boys. The young woman bent forward to look at the family tree more closely. She was looking for others who, like the two boys, had no living descendants and whose line of tree therefore ended in midair. The most conspicuous was one of her grandmother's brothers, a great-uncle whose name she could never remember, but who was reputed to have had a very strangely shaped nose. She spotted two more lines ending in mid-air before her stance became too uncomfortable. Unable to bend forward any longer, she straightened up and turned away from the paper and photographs. As she did so, the baby in her womb kicked. She winced and smiled and held her stomach. At least her line wasn't going to end in midair. Our personal characteristics depend on our genes, chemical instructions as to how we should develop and function. These instructions are packaged in sperm and eggs and passed down our family tree, finally reaching us via our genetic parents. And we inherit more than our family face via these genes. We also inherit many aspects of our physiology, psychology, and behavior, including much of our sexual behavior. This book's task is to work out why we behave sexually as we do. Our approach is simple. We shall ask why it is that people with some sexual strategies, patterns of sexual behaviors, are more successful reproductively than people with others. Our measure of success will be the number of descendants people achieve, because this is what shapes future generations. Families and populations become dominated by the descendants of their most successful ancestors. They also become dominated by those people's characteristics. In the scene we just saw, the younger woman's generation was dominated by her great-grandmother's face, not by a great-uncle whose nose, for all she knew, her generation was also dominated by a family sexuality passed on by so many people by her dynasty's founders, her great-grandparents. Nobody will have inherited directly the sexuality of great-uncle who, whatever his sexual strategy might have been, it was unsuccessful and he left no descendants to inherit that strategy. It is irrelevant to our generation whether people in the past wanted many children and grandchildren or whether it just happened. The only factor to shape our characteristics is who in the past had children and how many, and who did not. The great-grandmother and great-grandfather in scene 1 were probably most dismayed when their sexual fun produced a child, but if it hadn't, the younger woman and her 50 or so family contemporaries would not have lived. In effect, each generation plays a game in which its members compete to pass their genes on to the next generation. Each generation has its winners, like the pretty girl in the picture, and each has its losers, like her two brothers and great-uncle. We are the descendants of the winners, the people whose sexual strategy paid off. The generation game has not ended. It will continue for as long as some people in a generation have more children than others. In our own generation, the game is as active and cruel as ever. It will still be the genes of those among us who produce the most descendants that will characterize future generations, not the genes of those who produce few or none. Whether we know it or not, whether we want it or not, and whether we care or not, we are all programmed to try to win our generation's game of reproduction. We are all programmed to pursue reproductive success. Our successful ancestors have saddled us inescapably with genetic instructions which tell us not only that we must compete, but also how to. Inevitably, some of us will have more successful ancestors than others, so that even in our generation, there will be some people who have inherited instructions for potentially better strategies. When our generation comes to work out its final score, some people will have done better than others. We are about to start investigating why it is that some people are more successful than others in life's generation game. That concludes the preface and first chapter. If you've enjoyed this content or found it worthwhile, don't hesitate to like, share, subscribe, donate, and comment. As a reminder, the next chapter will be available on YouTube and all my platforms, while Chapter 3 onward will be exclusive to my alternate platforms. So make sure to subscribe, if you haven't already, to my channels on BitChute, MGTOW.tv, and Odyssey. Until next time, each and every one of you is a miracle. Don't waste a moment.